Thank you. Is the microphone? I don't know.
So it's for the distance students is all.
Yeah, is this, how do I tell if it's on? Oh, there we go. Great. So can the distance students hear me as well? Can you guys hear me?
A little bit.
Sounds like it's low.
I'll let them figure that out. You're not going to miss anything in the first minute. So. As Jason said, Corey Spencer, Director of Product Management at Adobe. And what I'd like to talk to you guys about today is the fact that I was in this room longer ago than I'd like to admit, as a student, also going through IP&T. And what I learned actually has facilitated my entire career. So one of the interesting things, the agenda for today is I'm going to talk about my career history, because I worked at BYU as an instructional designer, did a lot of other things, and now direct product management at Adobe. It's kind of an interesting path. What is an instructional designer? What is a product manager? And how are they alike? And there's a lot of very close similarities. So first, as you can tell, I spend a lot of time on the design of my deck. I just like to keep it simple. Next week is Adobe's big summit. So we'll be in Vegas next week with about 20,000 Adobe customers. And I've been in PowerPoint heck for the last 2 months, and so I just didn't have the creative energy to do anything but white on black, so I'm going to apologize. So BYU, so my background actually originally was in, at the time, BYU had a major communications with emphasis on TV production. And I produced videos. This was back when we did analog editing. And Adobe came up with a product called Premiere, and I couldn't wait to learn about video editing digitally. And that one skill led me into the opportunity to work for Independent Study as a student, helping make instructional videos. Now this was the very beginning of the industry, and we were putting the first BYU Independent Study course online. And it was a big deal. It was a Doctrine and Covenants course. I worked with, our director was named Dwight Laws at the time, and there's a group of us that were going to put the very first course from BYU on the internet. It was, everyone was really scared for lots of reasons. At first, at the time, BYU and the internet didn't really know how they were supposed to get along. There's lots of questions about whether or not BYU should even allow the internet on the campus. This was in the mid-90s, yeah, well, late 90s, probably 97, 98. So there was a lot of discussions like, are we facilitating things that we shouldn't facilitate by admitting that the internet exists? There was a lot of conversations about how do we do this. And at the time, President Bateman said, I want videos in the courses. Nobody had broadband internet, so we would burn videos. They were 320 by 240, Cinepak codec compressed, kind of looked like the worst videos you've ever seen of just talking heads. We would burn those on CDs and send them to the students. And then they would take all the content from the course would be online, and they would say, watch a video here, and then push a button, and the video would play from their drive. And so, even though we were putting the courses online, we were still mailing things out. That was a little weird, but it was fine. It was still super cutting edge. And I was just a student working, and I fell in love with the entire discipline of instructional psychology. I was working with Independent Study, instructional designers, and I was like, this is awesome. I can get distracted very quickly, and this was like I knew, like I don't want to just make videos, I want to make videos that have purpose, have meaning, are going to affect things, I want to create multimedia. At the time, we bought a software called Flash 3. I learned how to use it for animations, became a Flash developer, was a Macromedia beta tester. Some of you don't even know what Macromedia is. I just loved the whole field of building multimedia for educational purposes. And John Ubell, I started working with him. He was in the Center of Design, Instructional Design. I said, I need to get on full time so I don't have to pay tuition anymore. And he was like, well, that's a cute goal. Because I was not even a senior yet. But then an opening happened back in Independent Study for developing high school courses. So before I'd even graduated I wasn't even in the instructional psychology department yet from a master's degree. I was still an undergrad, but I weaseled my way into being a full-time employee for the independent study program, building high school courses. And then I felt like I should probably get a degree in this, and eventually got into IP&T, and I've loved it. It was great. I did that, worked at BYU for about 4.5 years, full-time, building high school courses. And built dozens of high school courses, had thousands of students go through what we did. We did something, I managed all of the science and math courses, but then managed all of the multimedia for all of the independent study courses. And we did it was kind of a fun time. The internet was the Wild West. There was a new plugin every day that everyone thought was going to change the world. We were fighting over whether or not our stuff was supposed to support Microsoft or Netscape 4.7. Like, there was all of these crazy debates going on around not just the things that we were building, but how people would consume it, because there was not a real strong standard yet. And so you kind of had to pick your battles every month or so. There was some new battle that we had to pick on. Can a learner have a good experience doing this? And so I did that for a few years, and then a friend of mine was at a startup called Omniture, and he said, "Hey, we need someone to come and own all of our training." So there's about 120 employees at Omniture at the time, and they said, "We need someone to be our first curriculum manager and build the content." And I had no idea what Omniture did. I had no idea. Web analytics data was like, some people would have a hitter count on their website. That would be a GIF that would rotate, but that was about it. And I went to go meet with who was the director of product at the time, and thought this could be pretty cool. And so, sans thesis, I did not complete my thesis, and I feel really bad about that. I went to go work at Omniture to own all of the curriculum development for Omniture. Now, there's some things I learned very quickly. There's a lot I learned working at BYU, and it was, and I'll talk about those, about objective-based learning, or learning objectives very clearly stated, and working very closely with subject matter experts. Some of the things I didn't learn is the speed and agility required to work in a growing startup SaaS model company. So I had a luxury at BYU to say, here's the 10 courses I'm going to get done this year. And here's how I'm going to map out my year. And I will simply go to high school or teachers and say, here's what I need you to do. And they did it. And it was great, especially if you're working with high school teachers, because you're paying them. And they will do anything you say if you're paying them. And so it went really well. And then I went over to this software as a service company that had a release every two to 4 months, that had a highly technical use case they were trying to resolve. For those who don't know, Omniture was the pioneer in web data. So a lot of Google Analytics, before Google Analytics, there was Omniture. Site Catalyst was their primary product. Most enterprises, if you've ever heard of a company, they probably use Omniture, which is now Adobe Analytics, for all of their web data. But that was brand new. The very first course I ever developed for Omniture was, what is web analytics? And because we were going into companies that had just spent $1 million buying something and teaching people what it is that they bought, because no one knew what it was. But they would have a release every 2 to 4 months, and they would update things, they would have new features, they'd have new products, and we had to have trainers and curriculum ready for those releases. And so there was never, and everything changed at the last minute all the time. Some features made it, some features didn't, some changes happened, naming conventions changed, screenshots changed, and so we had to create a much more agile-based process for developing content. So one of the first things I learned going into the private sector was that I had very few luxuries that I had working in the public sector, or at least working here at BYU. So I had to get to know my subject matter expert was good. They were super busy. Taking time costs money. they had stuff to do. If I go and I bug an engineer and say, I don't understand how to explain this highly technical thing, that's time the engineer should be spent writing code. So I'm costing Omniture money by getting up to speed on things. It was a constantly evolving field. When I started at Omniture, 80% of the traffic had dial-up speed internet. I know that because I could run that report, and within 2 years, those numbers had switched. 80% had broadband internet, and so the way that we could deliver our content, all of that radically changed. There were browser changes, there's cookie enablement changes. Like, I could sit here and go on for an hour on the things that would change in our curriculum every 2 or 3 months, and that we had to stay on top of. One of the things I was really proud of is that our curriculum was better than our documentation. That doesn't happen very often in software, but I had this great team, and we would just get into it. We all learned the products so that eventually we could become the subject matter experts. That was a tough thing for us. None of us came, all of the people that I hired on that team were all instructional designers, and within a month we're like, we've all got to become web analysts, because we have to be able to empathize better with these people, and we have to, I can't waste Adobe's time, or Omniture's time, teaching us how to teach people. And interestingly enough, all of those original instructional designers, a part of my team, all work in web analytics today. And they learned it so well, they did it professionally going forward. So that was an intense, I was employing 140 something in 2004. In 2 years later, when I left Omniture, there were over 1,000 employees. So along with all of our customer training, we also had an entire different track for internal training and sales training, and our team managed all of that. So it was incredibly rapid, it was a lot of fun, and we, on a number of occasions, had large accounts. We actually created this huge library of videos, so if we weren't making changes to the official curriculum, we were recording videos on how to do stuff. We had a number of big accounts say, this is highly technical stuff, but what we called Omniture University was the differentiator between success in buying the product and utter failure in wanting our money back. So the fact that we could get a customer getting value, what happens a lot in that industry, a salesperson who's great at their job comes in and makes lots of promises. The engineers say, well, this is actually what we can deliver, and then somebody has to make up the difference. And we always felt like that was our job as trainers and as educators of this product, is to make sure that the customers walk out feeling value in what they purchased and being empowered to improve their occupation, really. So I did that for a few years, and then there was other years. So then for about so one of the things that happens when you work in a fast-moving SaaS company, and you're an instructional designer and you get to know this stuff really well, is you wonder if you can do it yourself. Like, could I go and do this? And also when you're around people who are making millions of dollars overnight, you say, why don't I make millions of dollars overnight? And so you get a little entrepreneurial. And so some friends and I started a series of startups, each with varying degrees of lack of success, for about a decade. And it ranges. So like a group of friends and I, we went into franchising. We built franchise systems, and I would manage all of the marketing because I had the academic knowledge on how to use these products, but none of the field experience. I was like, oh, let's figure it out. So handled all the online marketing, and then in the franchise world, there's a lot of training and a lot of education. And so did that for years, did a lot of consulting for a while. And those were like went many months without taking home a paycheck, trying to make things happen, had some lowercase wins, some uppercase losses. And about 5.5 years ago, a friend of mine sold his company to Adobe. Now what had happened in the time I left Omniture and in the 8 years I wandered, Adobe started an entirely new business unit that they call the Experience Cloud. Adobe loves clouds. We have the Document Cloud, we have the Creative Cloud, and we have the Experience Cloud. And they created the Experience Cloud by going and acquiring Omniture for $1.6 billion and started an entire new business around digital or data processing and analytics for customers. And a friend of mine sold his little tiny company to Adobe. Adobe has purchased a number of companies. And he called me and said, hey, I'm moving to Utah. I need someone to help me. Have you ever thought of product management? And at that point, I'd done just about everything else in the industry. I'd built training, I'd built marketing collateral, I'd actually done even worked with lawyers around enforcing specific contractual standards. I had been a developer, so I was a Flash developer, and then I was actually a web developer because I needed one and nobody else was cheap enough. And so I was like, yeah, I'd be interested in product management. So about 5 years ago, I came over to Adobe and kind of fell backwards into product management, didn't really have any education or knowledge in what it was. And so over the last 5 years, started just as a product manager, worked my way up to senior product manager, then a group leader, and then about a year and a half ago, director of product management for Adobe. Been there for 5 years, have had the pleasure of working with one of the best teams on the planet. We have had a blast for the last 5 years. I thoroughly enjoy it. What my team owns is it's more or less data ingestion. So we own how customers get data into the Adobe Experience Cloud and Experience Platform. If you've been on the web today, you've unknowingly used my software. Our software is on most enterprise, including BYU, most enterprise companies in the world. Our flagship is a product called Launch that makes tag management really easy for first and third party, but we also manage all of the JavaScript that goes on sites and SDKs that go on apps that ultimately send data to Adobe and allow for customized experiences on websites. So I came out of that kind of self-imposed trial and have had the chance to work with the biggest companies in the world. In fact, and not just like I was on the phone last night till 10 o'clock at night working with a company called Reliant out of India. It's the largest company in India. Their CEO is the richest man in India, and he was on the call because he had some questions. That was intimidating. But Disney, Apple, our code is the only thing on Apple.com's website that wasn't written by Apple engineers. If you want to know stress, work with Apple in any capacity. One thing that we learned is that when Tim Cook gets up and announces something on stage, everyone who's in charge of making sure that data from the Apple Store is appropriately sent so they know how successful this is, they find out about what's being announced the same time you and I do. And so when you see the Apple Store go down for like an hour after a major announcement, that's because they're frantically figuring out what the heck they're supposed to do and make sure that our code is doing what it's supposed to do before it goes back up. They seem happy, I don't know. And Disney is a lot of fun to work with. American Express isn't, but there's just a lot of companies that you get into some pretty cool conversations with, and I've loved it. And as a product manager, I feel like everything that I learned as going through instructional psychology still applies. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about, is because I've done a bunch of different things, I still come back to those root things that I learned as a college student, trying to build something that someone can learn from. So, what is an instructional designer? I should ask you guys, it's been a while since I've been one, but the way that I've always thought about it is when I was an instructional designer, my job was to create a good educational experience for a learner to be able to receive what they need to from specific content and be successful in whatever it is that they're trying to learn. And so, as an instructional designer, when I worked for BYU, I would go talk to subject matter experts. I would try to get the information from them. I would orchestrate a good experience as much as I could. I would make sure that I had the right materials, and I would own that entire process from beginning to end. When someone came into one of my courses to when they left and they took an assessment, I was accountable for that. And if there was any issues with that, then I was accountable for that, and I needed to make sure that they were clear. I've worked with other instructional designers in the professional world who feel like their job, frankly, is to make sure that whatever I give them is formatted correctly in PDF and then sent to other people. And that their job is to make sure that that's the right H3 tag and these are the right bullets that we use when we format stuff. I don't consider that instructional design. I consider that format. Right, I may have been that causes some distress towards instructional designers at Adobe when I work with them and I say, I'm sorry you're not good enough to work on my project. There have been times when I've had to pull, there's a completely different department at Adobe that's in charge of training now, and they'll try to get up to speed on my product, and I'll say, you're just not good enough. If I need to send someone to be trained on my product, I'll send one of my own people to do it. You need to get better and you need to own the experience. Because that's what I believe instructional design is. It can be really hard to say when someone walks in, when they hit that first page or they click play or they walk into a room and when they leave, that you own that experience. But to me, that is what instructional design is. And especially with IP&T, how am I using technology to own that experience and to make sure it's the best that it can be. Product management is the same thing. So when I hire a new PM and they come onto my team, I explain, this is one slide that I show them all the time. So in the world of product, now this is specific to software development, but I'm sure it relates to most products. Most teams have very well mapped out jurisdiction. So when I go and I say I'm going to build a new product, so for example, when I decided I wanted to build Launch, and it was a brand new product, there's a lot of stress involved in building it and getting around and just getting approvals. But I knew engineering knows what engineering's job is. Their job is to write the code and to ensure that everything works appropriately and that the architecture is scalable. And they know exactly what their job is. And they know if an email comes in, whether or not it applies to them. Marketing knows their job. Their job is to get people excited about what it is that we're building. And at Adobe, they don't actually give a lot of input into the product team. Most of it is the product team tells them what we're building, and their job is to publicize that and to generate leads for Adobe. Sales, generally, his job is to say whatever they want to get the sale done. A lot of the times, but their goal is to, like when the lead comes in, they've got to land the sale. And they know exactly what their job is. And frankly, they won't do an inch more than that, which is fine by me. And then you've got a lot of overhead, which is security, legal, a lot of other things. I put instructional design in there for software. You've got a lot of other stuff that has to happen that you probably didn't realize when you first started building something. For example, I've spent the last 3 days on calls with legal and security over some new things that we want to release, and it has to be right, and we have to have the right wording, and it will probably take us weeks just to get things that have nothing to do with building a product done so that we can release something and make sure that it's properly supported. Product management is kind of everything else. So there's no day that a PM goes in and says, this is all my job is. A product manager's job is to make sure the entire endeavor is successful. It's kind of, some people say it's a mini CEO. I don't know if I'd ever go that far, but if you take on stewardship, your job is to make sure that that is successful. That the experience of the product, from the second that someone logs into it, to the second that they complete the thing that they came to do, that they had the experience that you would expect. I always think of it, because of my background in TV, as kind of the showrunner. Right? I don't write the scripts, I don't direct, I don't cast. We got people who do that, but my job is this is the story that we're telling. This is the experience, and at the end of it, this is what somebody has to feel when they've completed whatever it is that they've come in to do in my software. And so some days I spend a lot of time talking to security and legal, and other times I'm helping sales because there's a question from a customer. A lot of the time, actually, the truth is this is a very heavy part of what I do is work directly with engineering. I work with marketing, and then in the center of this is the customer. And my job is to talk to the customers, to empathize with the customers, to know what the customers want, and then to go back to these teams and properly explain that through requirements and through whatever means I have, and the goal being that someone has a great experience. It's very similar to product management, or to instructional psychology, if you think about it not as the vehicle, but you think of it as the purpose. The purpose is to create the right experiences for the right people at the right time, whether you're teaching someone to do something or whether you're trying to get them to use your product. My product's very technical. It's mostly used by developers, my products. They come in and their questions are whether or not they should load JavaScript synchronously or asynchronously, whether or not dynamic variables can be grabbed from a data layer that's loading at the top of the page, at the bottom of the page. They ask highly technical questions about security. They ask highly technical questions about a lot of things. I can't answer all of their questions, but my job is to make sure that all of those questions get answered, and that they have a good experience. So, how are these alike? There's 4 things I specifically thought of as I started putting this together, where what I learned as an instructional designer have directly affected me as a product manager. First, objective-based. For an instructional designer, at least when I worked in independent study, that was the first thing that we did. Before we ever wrote a chapter or had anyone do anything, we would have at the very title page, by the end of this chapter, you should be able to do the following. And then we would use verbs. You should be able to explain. You should be able to teach. You should be able to complete. You should be able to answer. And we would start with those very simple tenets. By the end of X, you should be able to do Y. That was ingrained in me from a guy named Dwight Laws. From the second I walked into working for him to the second that I left, it was, where are the clear objectives for anything? And at the end of every single lesson, we would say, by the end of this lesson, you should have been able to do these things. Do you feel like you can? And if not, go back and complete and redo the lesson. From a product management standpoint, it's very similar. When I have someone log into my product, I should be able to say, when you use this product, you should be able to, and ideally as intuitively as possible using the UI with the least amount of explanation, you should be able to do this, do this, do this, do this. And if there's any friction in you doing that, then my job is to help take away that friction. So being objective-based has been critical. You'd be maybe not surprised at how many software programs and companies release products that don't start with a very basic tenet of what should a customer be able to do when they first log into the product. What should they be able to do? If a customer needs to do X, what is the path for X and to get them to Y? That is incredibly important. It's one of the things I drill in any time. So in Adobe, when you want to build something new, you have, it's called a CA. It's called a concept accept. You have to present to me and a few other people and say, this is this thing I want to build. And I'm notorious for saying, this first slide I need to see is objectives. What are the objectives for the customer and what are the objectives for Adobe? Sometimes we want customers to do something because it's easier for Adobe. By the end of this, we should be able to decrease escalations to client care by doing X, Y, and Z. I want a clear objective, and that's something that I learned here. In fact, that's one thing that even with our documentation, I've been very picky about making sure that in this documentation, you should learn how to do the following things. Data-driven. So in instructional psychology, you guys are, it's kind of lucky because almost all of the times there's some sort of assessment. In the private world, there isn't usually an assessment unless you're doing a certification, and we built some of those. But when you're building something in the educational world, a student is usually pretty motivated because they have to take a test. And that test is data. And at the end of the day, did this successfully teach them? Or did they successfully learn, maybe is a better way of putting it? And you have a very clear metric you can go to and say, X% of people passed this test, X% of people did not pass this test. And then you can dig deeper and actually go into which questions are working, or the stems and the distractors, which I'm very proud that I still remember that terminology, for the different questions, and go through and say, how are these things crafted? And then try to determine if it's the content or the test that may be affecting some of those scores. It can be acutely data-driven, and particularly, again, in any situation where there's assessment. That is great. In product management world, there isn't always, well, there's almost never an assessment, unless you're building something to help someone with an assessment. So you need to create your own assessments. And so you need to sit down and say, how do I judge if this thing is being successful? It is one of the things that I love about working at Adobe is maybe violently obsessed with data on the customers and their experiences. And so there's to the point where many arguments are usually start off with, how do I judge the success of a particular product? Is it that they completed the task that we expected them to do, or did they complete it in the least amount of time possible? Is it successful if someone has to go up to the help section, or is that what the help section is for? Do we want to decrease that, or do we want to accept that as a cost of business? If somebody comes in and shows frustration by bouncing around the application on a regular basis before actually completing that, all of those things are kind of objective but secret assessments that are going on all the time. And it's important from a product management is to start off with, how does somebody pass this? How do I know that this was successful? If I can't ask them to take a test, how do I write my own test in the data to start judging the success of any particular feature or product? And so out of the gate, you guys are already learning the value of that assessment. And whether or not you say an IP&T or anything, it's the same thing in marketing. As I worked with designers, when I worked in marketing, I would come with all this data, and sometimes I'd feel threatened. In fact, here's a great example. When I worked at BYU as an instructional designer, I decided one year I was going to take most of the year and just do one course, because all my courses were doing great. And I picked a US history course. And I was like, I'm going to blow the doors off this US history. I'm going to create the best high school course that Adobe Independent Studies ever done. And we got green screens, we shot video, there was a subplot, there was tons of stuff we did. We went all out for it. And Dwight Laws, our director, we released it. It actually won an award. I was really proud of that. About 6 months later, Dwight Laws pulled me in, our director, and said, I want you to take a look at the assessment differences between that big fancy course you made and the year before when it was just plain text with videos. And there was no statistically significant difference in the assessments. And he was like, I'm really glad that you did that, but that was a big project and it spent a lot of money and you put a lot of other things on hold, and it didn't change anything. And I think of that pretty often when I go like, here's this huge idea, and without saying, well, how, I didn't start by saying, how do I judge success of this? How I judged success was my own feeling of self-gratification. To be like, look at this cool thing. It didn't help the students anymore. And so that's an important thing that I've carried with me, is being data-driven. The next is the need for empathy. So I think one of the things you gain through IP&T is it requires you to put yourself in the learner's position. Every good instructional designer I knew was highly empathic. They would say, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm a learner and I'm coming in for the first time. And they would role play that. And they would try to empathize. What does it feel like to be someone who's learning about this for the first time? And they would come back to that as often as they could. And I think that's kind of ingrained actually in the software of anyone who wants to get into this, is I want to make a difference, I want to make people's lives better, and that comes from having empathy. One of the reasons I have empathy is I am still dyslexic. So I had a very bad high school situation. I barely made it through high school. Literally, I graduated high school because my dad convinced my English teacher to pass me on my last test. And then I went to BYU, Idaho on probation. I started my college career on academic probation, and then went through, and then I kind of figured out what I liked. And things kind of worked out for me, and I dug it. But one of the reasons I wanted to get into IP&T is that I totally knew what it felt like to go through school and need a different pace than everybody else, or need a different experience than everybody else. And it's one of the things I loved about working at BYU, especially for high school students, is providing that for the kid who's like, look, I'm just a slower reader, I'm not dumber. Is there just something that I can do at my own self, my own pace? And growing up in the early 90s, I didn't have that, but kids today do have those opportunities, and I think it's because of people who are in IP&T. That ability to empathize with someone is also really important in product management. In product management, you go in and you have to be able to put yourself in the customer's shoes. And there's two things you have to do. You need the experience of talking to the customers. So I spend a lot of time away from my family just talking to customers. Last year, I went to China, Japan, Tokyo, Israel, London, like 4 different times. I'm going to lose track. Name a country. Spain, go to New York, San Francisco, San Jose. Almost every month, my passport is getting a workout. And a lot of it is because I need to be able to, when I go back to that crazy blob thing, I need to be able to represent the user. I need to be able to stand there, and when engineering says, should we do X or Y, I need to have conviction when I say Y. And that's my job. In fact, I think a product manager's biggest job is to be able to explain why this matters to a customer. Engineering is going to take care of the how, and product's going to explain everything else to somebody. But the why is this important to a customer? That's what a product manager has to nail. And if they nail that, everything else is fine. So that empathy, of being able to sit down and talk to someone who, honestly, I don't know that JavaScript. My stuff deploys JavaScript. I couldn't write a line of it if I had to, but I know what their struggles are because I've spent thousands of hours over the last 5 years talking to them and trying to be able to represent them to our company. And in case I didn't say this enough, experience focused. I firmly believe for every company and every university and every school, experience is the new commodity. Adobe recently, we renamed ourselves from the Marketing Cloud to the Experience Cloud. We believe very strongly in this. I believe very strongly in this, that somebody will judge an entire institution based on a single experience, good or bad. If you talk to Marriott, they'll tell you, and I know this from experience, their biggest fear is that someone's entire experience with Marriott could be ruined by one rude person walking through a hallway. They know that all these things that they put into their apps and into their website and everything else, at the end of the day, Marriott is judged by the experience the customers have. Delta, exact same thing. They're judged by the experience from the beginning to the end. I think instructional designers, the good ones that I worked with, are the same way. When somebody starts one of my courses and they complete it, I want the full experience. My job isn't just to make sure that things are formatted correctly and in the right PDF and on the website or whatever, but to make sure the experience of learning is correct. It is instructional psychology and technology. We need to use both of those things to create the right instructional experience. Product management, the good PMs that I work with feel the same way. When somebody first logs into my product, what is the full experience? What are they doing the entire time? How can I affect that? How can I make it better? It's a very iterative process. The products that I've released, you start with what's the most important thing first, and then you can start building on it. But if you hit the most important thing and make it a good experience, even if you don't have all of the features, customers will come back to you because they see a dedication to the product. Customers leave a product when they feel a dedication to the profits. When they feel, I know I'm at BYU, so the money profits. When they feel that you're dedicated to making money off of them, they go, eh. When they feel like you're dedicated to creating a good experience for them, they'll stick around. They'll stick around through the thick and the thin. I've had customers get on forums and Twitter and defend my product when I knew at the time the competitors had more features. But they felt invested and they saw the experience we were trying to create, and so they wanted to be a part of that journey. So those are the 4 things I think that are most important. Being objective-based, being data-driven, and for the record, these 2 things are not contradictory. So being data-driven and having empathy is what gives the data meaning. You can be data-driven and it can mean nothing to you, and you're nothing more than a human calculator. But once you put a face on that data and you create empathy, then it starts meaning something, and that's when you can really be experience-focused. So if someone has a great experience using your product, using your course, viewing your video, visiting your website, whatever it is, from beginning to end, the experience is what matters. So that's, last is I'll just open the time for questions, but that's the presentation that I have for today. So we have about 10 minutes. Any questions? All right.
For those of us who want to become
Microphone.
entrepreneurs, what if you can tell the younger, for those of us who want to become entrepreneurs, if you could go to a younger version of yourself before you did those years, what would you tell them?
Very, very good question. Just that it's hard, but everything's hard. Every job's hard. It's just a different type of hard. And I think the things that I would have gone back and changed if I was doing entrepreneurship again is, one, the most important thing is to pick your partners carefully. Because you will be through all of the bad stuff. There's going to be good stuff, but if you, like that whole adage of being slow to hire and quick to fire, that means more in a startup than anything else. Be incredibly selective about who you partner with, incredibly selective about who you add to your team, because you're just not going to have the time to correct mistakes. You're going to have to correct mistakes. That's the other thing I'm going to tell you about. But you can't afford an investment in somebody that's not going to pay off. So you have to have high levels of trust in their competence and in their ethics. Because I've been burned by both, frankly. People who unfortunately were unethical and other people who were unfortunately incompetent. The second I would say is fail quickly and iterate fast. So one of the things a startup has going for it is very little skin in the game. So they can be like, oh, that was wrong, let's iterate, let's pivot, let's move. Big companies like Adobe, it takes us 5 years to move. It's a giant thing. And if our CEO says, hey, I want to rename these things and I want to change our focus, it'll be at least 2 years before that bubbles up anywhere. And so agile companies have the ability to sit down, don't be too in love with your own idea to throw it out and do something else. And that's the other mistake that we made. At one point, we got so in love with it, we mama beared this idea, and it didn't work, and we didn't iterate fast enough and accept a short failure and go after a bigger success. We just held on to it, and it just became a big failure. Does that make sense?
Can you talk about the difference between project management and product management and the skill set required for both?
Yeah, in Adobe we call it program management, just because it's not confusing enough. And yeah, so great, very good question. So for example, I'm starting a new project. I'm working with a director of engineering and I'm working with a program manager. And in this case, the program manager's job is to hold the product manager and the program manager accountable for the commitments that we make and to help us make sure that anyone else that we have dependencies on are also held accountable for that. So a lot of Babu's the guy that I work with, he's out of New York. A lot of what his job is to ensure that we're having the right meetings, but always bringing up, here's how we agree that we're judging success, here's the commitments that everybody made. Are we on track for making these commitments? If we're not, what do we need to do to change things? And then communicating that up. In a certain degree, our program manager is the objective referee in the building of the product. He's got no skin in the game because he's purposefully, his job is to observe and to report on what's happening and then to help us in cases where there's friction, get those things ironed out. And I think it's a very critical role. It's highly undervalued in software development. A lot of times people will say like, oh, an engineer should be able to manage their own projects. Maybe, but the bigger the company, the harder that is. Does that help answer?
Yeah.
If an instructional designer was sort of interested in shifting more towards a project management or product management career, what kinds of things in that sort of transition
So a few people have asked me how to get into product management, and I haven't seen any really clear ways because there isn't like a product management major anywhere. The closest thing is I've seen MBA students. I usually don't hire MBA students fresh out of college, but I have hired other majors fresh out of college. I won't say that's a totally different discussion for another time, but. Generally speaking, the best way to get into product management is to find an industry that you're passionate about and to get involved with it. There are two ways. I have seen people with MBAs get into it, and then more often people like myself fall backwards into it and say, I'm really passionate about this, they get involved, and then they present themselves as an opportunity and say, I think I could I could own this and make it better. And then I guess the third way is to just build it yourself. You know, if you're building out, you know, just your own career, is just say I want to be a product manager, or build a product yourself as a product manager. But that is one of the biggest problems that we have in the industry is that there isn't a clear, like there's not a really easy way for me to just go find people who have studied product management. It's usually been a bullet point on some larger business school thing that they did. And they're as interested in being a product manager as they are in being a CEO. And I prefer them focus on being a product manager. Any other questions?
Could you explain some of the differences between when you first started as a product manager and as you've moved up levels? How have your responsibilities changed? Do you oversee other product managers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I kind of fell into product management, there was me and I had 6 engineers, and I had a product that had already been built, and I was in charge of making it better, and I thought it sucked. And that's kind of what happened. So I was like, ugh. And so after my first year, I made that product progressively better. So I got to know the customers, I worked really hard, I worked with the engineering team, and we made the product better. Marginally better, increased adoption, increased customer satisfaction, NPS scores, et cetera. It's very tactical. It's very like getting my hands dirty.